13 colonies lit a fire that would forge a new nation, but there was a 14th, a colony larger than all the others combined, invited, cajoled, and even invaded to join the revolution. It refused. This isn't the story you were taught in school. It's not a simple tale of loyalty to a king. It's a story of fear, of shrewd calculation, and of a betrayal that sliced a continent in two. Why did Canada turn its back on the American dream? The answer lies not in London, but in the smoldering ruins of a recent war and a deep-seated suspicion of the very people claiming to be liberators. Before the first shots were even fired at Lexington, the Continental Congress was already looking north. They drafted passionate letters, not to a government, but directly to the people of Quebec. They spoke of liberty, of throwing off the yoke of tyranny, of joining as a sister colony in a grand new experiment. "We are your friends, not your enemies," they wrote. They promised them a future free from the whims of a distant king. On paper, it was a compelling offer, a chance to join a movement that would change the world. But the people reading those letters, the French-speaking Catholic Canadiens, remembered a different promise from a different group of English speakers, and it had ended in fire and conquest just 15 years earlier. You can't understand 1775 without understanding 1759. The Battle of the Plains of Abraham wasn't ancient history to the people of Quebec. It was a fresh wound. Their parents had fought and died defending this land from the British. They had watched their world burn. Now, under British rule, they were a conquered people, suspicious of any English-speaking authority. And who were the foot soldiers of that British conquest? The very same colonists from Massachusetts, New York, and Virginia, who were now calling them brothers. The American revolutionaries were, in the eyes of the Canadiens, the same people who had helped conquer them. The plea for liberty sounded a lot like the rhetoric of their old enemies. Just as American discontent was boiling over, London made a brilliant, cynical move. In 1774, Parliament passed the Quebec Act. To the Americans, it was one of the intolerable acts, an outrageous power grab. But to the French Canadians, it was a lifeline. The act did three incredible things. First, it guaranteed their right to practice Catholicism freely. Second, it restored French civil law for private matters. Third, it expanded Quebec's borders deep into the Ohio Valley, the very land the American colonies were desperate to expand into. The British Crown, their conqueror, was now offering them something the American revolutionaries, with their deep-seated anti-Catholic bigotry, never could: cultural survival. They could keep their language, their religion, and their laws. It was a devil's bargain, but a bargain nonetheless. Why trade a guaranteed existence for a vague promise of liberty from people who despised your faith? And that's the fatal flaw in the American plan. While one hand of the Continental Congress was writing letters of friendship to the Catholics of Quebec, the other was denouncing the Quebec Act as a plot to establish popery in North America. The colonists were furious that the king was protecting the very religion they feared and hated. This news traveled north fast. The Canadiens saw the hypocrisy. The Americans didn't see them as equals. They saw them as a strategic asset and their religion as a tool of the British enemy. The invitation to join the revolution felt less like a gesture of brotherhood and more like a trap. If you're finding this hidden history as fascinating as I do, make sure you're subscribed. The story only gets more intense from here. When persuasion failed, the Americans turned to force. In the fall of 1775, the Continental Army launched a two-pronged invasion of Canada. The plan was audacious. General Richard Montgomery would advance up the traditional route via Lake Champlain and capture Montreal. Colonel Benedict Arnold, Yes, that Benedict Arnold, then still an American hero, would lead a second force on a treacherous, near impossible march through the dense wilderness of Maine to surprise Quebec City. They weren't calling it an invasion, they called it liberation. They believed the French Canadians were just waiting for a little push to rise up and join them. They could not have been more wrong. Initially, it seemed to work. Montgomery's force faced weak British resistance and, with the help of some local sympathizers, captured Montreal in November without a fight. The gateway to Canada was open. But hundreds of miles away, Arnold's expedition was descending into a nightmare. They were battered by storms, their boats were smashed, and their supplies were lost. Men were reduced to eating their own leather shoes and belts. Of the 1,100 men who started the journey, hundreds turned back or died. The ones who finally emerged from the wilderness were not a conquering army. They were starving, half-frozen specters. The two American forces finally linked up before the walls of Quebec City in early December, but they were a shadow of an army. They were racked by smallpox, ill-equipped for a Canadian winter, and their enlistments were set to expire at the end of the year. Inside the fortress, the British governor, Guy Carleton, had organized a determined defense consisting of a few hundred British regulars and a much larger force of Canadian militia. The very people the Americans had come to liberate were now pointing muskets at them from the city walls. Montgomery knew his time was running out. He had to take the city, and he had to do it now. On the last day of 1775, under the cover of a blinding blizzard, the Americans launched their desperate assault. It was a catastrophe. Montgomery led his column against the southern walls and was killed almost instantly in the first volley of grape shot. His attack disintegrated. On the other side of the city, Arnold's column had more success, breaching the outer defenses, but Arnold himself was severely wounded, shot in the leg, and taken out of the fight. His second-in-command, Daniel Morgan, took over and fought bravely through the narrow streets, but he was eventually surrounded, trapped, and forced to surrender. The battle was a bloody, decisive defeat. The surviving Americans, now under the command of a wounded Arnold, maintained a pathetic siege of the city through the winter, but the spirit of the invasion was broken. They were starving, sick, and demoralized. When British reinforcements arrived by sea in the spring of 1776, it was all over. The Continental Army began a long, humiliating retreat back down to New York. The invasion of Canada was a complete failure. Not only had they failed to capture the 14th colony, they had achieved the exact opposite of their goal. They had terrified the Canadian population and proven that liberation was just another word for conquest. The American invasion had a profound psychological effect on the Canadians. Before the invasion, most were neutral, content to sit out a war between two groups of Englishmen. But the Americans had brought war to their homes. They had paid for supplies with worthless paper money. Their soldiers had behaved arrogantly, and their anti-Catholic prejudice was thinly veiled. The British, for all their faults, were now the defenders of their homes and their faith. The invasion forged an unlikely alliance, turning a conquered people into partners in the defense of Canada. The Americans had hoped to gain a colony. Instead, they helped create a country. But Quebec wasn't the only prize. What about the other northern colonies? Let's turn to Nova Scotia. If Quebec's story is about culture, Nova Scotia's is about power, specifically naval power. The capital, Halifax, was home to the Royal Navy's main North American base. It was a fortress city, bristling with cannons and packed with redcoats. For Nova Scotia to join the Revolution would be like a mouse trying to swallow a lion. The British military presence was simply overwhelming.
The situation in Nova Scotia was complicated because many of its settlers were New England planters, immigrants from Massachusetts and Connecticut who had arrived just a generation earlier. Culturally, they were Americans. They sympathized with their cousins to the south, but their economic lives were dominated by Halifax and its trade with Britain. The merchants of Halifax grew rich supplying the Royal Navy. To rebel would be to commit economic suicide. They were caught between their hearts and their wallets.
There was another ghost haunting Nova Scotia, the ghost of Acadia. Just 20 years earlier, the British had violently expelled thousands of French-speaking Acadians from their lands, fearing they would side with France. This brutal act of ethnic cleansing was a stark reminder of what the British were capable of when their authority was challenged. It was a powerful deterrent. Why risk rebellion when you've seen firsthand the devastating price of resistance? The memory of the Grand Dérangement served as a silent, terrifying warning.
There was one attempt at revolution in Nova Scotia. In 1776, a landowner named Jonathan Eddy, with support from Massachusetts, led a small force of rebels and attacked Fort Cumberland, but he failed to rally the local population. Most settlers, fearful of British retaliation and economically dependent on the crown, wanted nothing to do with it. The rebellion was quickly and easily crushed by British forces. It proved that sympathy for the American cause was not the same as a willingness to fight and die for it. The risk was too high, and the British grip was too tight.
If any lingering sympathy for the revolution remained in Nova Scotia, the Americans themselves helped extinguish it. American privateers, essentially legalized pirates, began raiding coastal towns in Nova Scotia, burning homes and stealing property. To the people on the receiving end, this wasn't a glorious war for liberty, it was terrifying banditry. These attacks alienated the population and pushed them further into the arms of the British, who, for all their faults, offered protection through the Royal Navy. The Americans were once again proving to be their own worst enemies in the quest for a 14th colony.
And then there was Newfoundland. It's easy to forget it was even a colony. In the 18th century, it wasn't so much a society as it was a giant seasonal fishing station. Its entire existence revolved around one thing: catching cod and shipping it to Europe. It had a small, scattered population that was utterly dependent on the British merchant fleet for supplies and the Royal Navy for protection from French and later American privateers. For Newfoundland, joining the American Revolution wasn't even a remote possibility. It would have been an act of mass suicide. They had no real local government, no militia to speak of, and no agricultural base to feed themselves. Their connection to Great Britain was not a political choice. It was their entire reason for being. To cut ties with the Crown would mean the end of the fishing trade, the end of protection, and the end of the supplies needed to survive the harsh winters. Revolution was a luxury they simply could not afford. As the war raged on, a new factor emerged that would seal Canada's fate forever: the United Empire Loyalists. Tens of thousands of colonists who remained loyal to the king were persecuted in the newly independent United States. They were harassed, their property was confiscated, and many were forced to flee for their lives. Where did they go? They fled north to Quebec and Nova Scotia. This massive wave of refugees fundamentally changed the demographic and political landscape of Canada. These weren't people who were neutral or undecided about the revolution. They were its bitter opponents. They had lost everything because of it. They brought with them a deep-seated loyalty to the Crown and an equally deep animosity towards the American Republic.
They became the bedrock of a new, distinctly British Canadian identity, founded on the principle of not being American. The final test came a generation later. In 1812, the United States, believing Canada would be an easy conquest, invaded again. But they found a very different country from the one they had tried to liberate in 1775. This time, English-speaking and French-speaking Canadians, the sons of Loyalists and the sons of Canadiens, fought side by side with British regulars to defend their land. They burned York, the future Toronto, but the defenders fought back, ultimately pushing the invaders out and even burning Washington in retaliation. The War of 1812 was the final, bloody confirmation. Canada would not be American. So why did Canada betray the Revolution? It didn't. Betrayal implies a prior allegiance that never truly existed. The colonies to the north were on a different path, shaped by different forces. Quebec was guided by a pragmatic fear for its cultural survival. Nova Scotia was chained by the economic and military might of the Royal Navy. Newfoundland was too isolated and dependent to even consider it. And the arrival of the Loyalists cemented a political identity in opposition to the American experiment. That single decision, or rather that series of decisions to say no, created the world we know today. It's the reason there are two great English-speaking nations in North America instead of one. It ensured the survival of French culture on the continent. It created a country built not on the fires of revolution, but on a more cautious, evolutionary path of compromise and order. The American Revolution didn't just create the United States, it inadvertently created Canada too. The story of the 14th colony is a reminder that history is never simple. It's a web of fear, self-interest, religion, and economics. The American story is one of a bold leap into the unknown. The Canadian story is one of choosing the devil you know over the devil you don't. Neither is right or wrong. They are simply different answers to the same terrifying question of how to build a nation in a dangerous world. So what do you think? Was Canada's choice a calculated act of self-preservation, a loyal defense of the crown, or a missed opportunity to create a single continental republic? The lines are blurry, and the answer probably lies somewhere in between. Let me know your perspective in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into a forgotten chapter of history, be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories you were never taught in school. Thanks for watching.